I'd like to begin somewhere near the present and go back a little bit. So in your most recent book, The Nordic Secret, you're described in various ways at the front. One of them is being a comedy writer. Mm-hmm. And I think we know that you can't become a good comedy writer with quite a rich set of experiences. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the kinds of experiences that gave rise to you having things to say that people would find funny.
You see, comedy is usually seen as not serious. Of course, you make people laugh, so people think it's easy, but it's one of the hardest things to write. You can write relatively good drama, and then you can have really great actors who make it work, and they think you wrote a great piece. But if you write comedy that doesn't work, it just doesn't work.
Right. So what makes it work
then? Surprise and pain, and that you push people's limits, and you set up an expectation, and then you puncture it. Right. So I mean, it's the sort of the story of, I mean, you always mention two things that are the same, and then the third thing is a surprise. Yes. So there's some standards to that. Of
course, but in your case, to get to the kind of mindset or awareness where you can both create the expectation and puncture it, you have to draw upon certain experiences and background. So give me some sense of the kinds of expectations and being punctured in your own life.
I would say that, you know, growing up in a Danish middle class where everything was very predictable, and then being a creative, well, I dare say rather intelligent girl in the 70s where it wasn't politically correct to be smarter than the average. I don't know what it's like in the British school systems, but in the Danish school system, that did not work out very well. So I spent a lot of my school years in the back row by the window, not necessarily throwing spitballs, but drawing and coming up with jokes about my teachers. And I actually started writing, doing school comedy, and figured out that, I mean, if I said all these stupid things in class, I would get scolded. If I took the same jokes to the stage at the spring concert in school, I had 500 parents laughing at it. Right. So it was like there was something in there that.
So you have disapproval in one context and approval in another.
And then you have, I mean, human frailty and vanity and character flaws and all the perfection that we want. And when you can puncture that, I mean, that's when you hit a point of pain. So our fears.
Right. And there's some context where you're allowed to do that, and it's sort of sanctioned culturally, like a comedy gig. Right. And some where you're really not meant to speak about that stuff.
Sure. I mean, in church, for instance, or where it's very serious, in politics. So if you, I mean, it's pulling down authority. Right. And what I did that from I was 11 to around 31, 32, I think, and then I realized that you can tear down with humor and satire, but you cannot build up. Okay. So I actually got tired of writing comedy because I thought I can do more with life. I can write something that creates something instead of just puncturing things that already exist and that people hold dearly somehow.
Okay. So around that time in your early 30s, you're sensing that you're tired of critiquing and ridicule and tearing down authority and the satire.
Yeah, I
and you
grew
want to
up
start building, right?
Yeah.
But there's also a sense of survival and personal construction.
Yeah,
through that.
I mean, if you're facing a system where you think that you're not allowed to express yourself and show what you're made of, and then you can puncture authority and you can get laughs and you become the class clown. And somehow I realized around age 30 that I was basically the class clown, but on Danish television. So I never performed on television, but I wrote for television. So I just felt that I've done this. Yes. It's time for me to contribute with something that can build up and enlighten people and make the world richer rather than just...
Okay, great. So how did you begin to do that? What kind of resources did you draw upon to do that?
Well, I was traveling a lot to the US in order to learn how they made sitcoms. So I went to Los Angeles and met with some people in the American TV industry and on an exchange tour and things like that. And traveling back and forth between Europe and the United States, I noticed, and other people have noticed that before me, that there are things they do in the United States that we do in Europe 5 to 10 years later, at least in the 90s. Now we do it simultaneously because of the internet, but in the 90s we didn't do that. So I wondered, why do we do that? Is it because we copy the Americans in Europe? or is it because there are structures of complexity that develop in the US before they develop in Europe? And I figured out it must be the structural thing. It's like women entering the workforce, the invention of the washing machine, families owning cars, television, all these things, they are developed and invented because of a need or a market for it. And that need and market develops a bit later in Europe, at least it did in the later half of the 20th century. And so from that experience, like, what about, can I use this to predict something about the future, not just in Europe, but also in the United States? I mean, can I see structures in our societies that are different, but yet so much alike that I can sort of extrapolate from the structures themselves and see what's going to happen in the United States and Europe? And I started guessing and working with it structurally, and then I also started reading about nanotechnology, biotechnology, and all these quantum computers, all these new things that were in the pipeline technologically. And then I started thinking, where are our societies heading? What is going on here? I mean, there's so many things coming that are going to be fundamentally different from what we know today. So that was in the mid-90s. And then what I wanted to do was to make a cop show taking place in Copenhagen in 2027, based on the technologies that I knew were in the pipeline, and guessing or developing scenarios for what that will look like 30 years out in the future. So that was around 97. So that was my beginning of writing more serious stuff. Unfortunately, it never became a TV show in Denmark, but I did all the research, and that got me into writing about the future.
Okay, so right, so fantastic. So it's a great example maybe of work that is not lost.
Right.
You know, that it might appear superficially like, oh, it didn't work out, but actually that formed you in some way.
Yeah.
The attempt to make something of cultural value gave you insight into what was of value. So tell us, I mean, I want to get to the future in a second, but I don't want to lose any key points in the process. You mentioned earlier on politics and religion as being serious places where you're not really meant to have satire and ridicule things. And a part of your maturation was kind of beginning to appreciate that there might be cases where satire was somehow juvenile rather than necessarily sort of properly critical in the right way. So was there any sort of phase around that time where you had second thoughts about some of those forms of authority? Or was that much later?
I think I've always had this sort of double attitude towards authority, because on the one hand I like to challenge them, on the other hand I realize that without authority and heritage and structures we have chaos, and that's not a good thing. Right. So there is always a balance between how much can you challenge the structures and the power without creating something that is worse. Right. And so that dialectic and double feeling has always been part of my approach, I think. And you also get some humor out of that, because it's there's a tension and a paradox inherent in that. Yeah. And you wrote about, I mean, at what point did you, I know you wrote about that at some stage. You've gone from either or to both and you have a great deal of work on that. But where are we in the chronology? Is that happening in your 30s or that happens later? That's around age 30. Right. That's when I started working on the future. Okay. And then what I sensed and what I started exploring as of 2000 was the world is becoming so complex, and we have people migrating, and we have science and religion, and we have new technologies, and we need to adjust our policy making and society and create new legislation, and we need to approach this in entirely new ways. This is going to be so complex that the old Aristotelian either-or logic, where either it's bad or it's, I mean, he doesn't say that, but sort of popular philosophy has reduced his philosophy to that.
It's an implicit logical negation, either it's this or it's that.
Right. Would not be complex enough for the future. Right. But the Eastern philosophy that sees opposites as making a whole, that had something to it that I needed to explore, and so that either or from Aristotle had to somehow become a both and. And then what I was realizing was that we're facing an existential choice as a species, not just as individuals. But as a species, we have to choose what kind of species do we want to be in the future.
Yes.
Because we got genetic engineering, we got artificial intelligence, we got all these things coming.
And then all those things together as
Right.
well. Yeah.
So, okay, I come from Denmark. Kierkegaard is our biggest philosopher, and he wrote either or. Makes total sense to write some books that
Both
are called both and.
Which is what in Danish? That's
Både og.
oh, okay, that's good. And the contention of that book is essentially that we need to move from either or to both and,
Yes.
and fleshing out what that means.
Right, and I mean, the both and can contain the either or.
Right.
The either or cannot contain the both and. So the both and is more complex than the either or.
So tell me, so this is the key point, I think, because it's something that's often overlooked. It's presented as another binary. Either you're either or you're both and.
Exactly.
But one of your key points is that the both and includes the either or somehow.
I mean, sometimes you have to choose.
Right.
I mean, if you're sailing a ship and there's a cliff in front of you, you can't say, I'm going to go in the middle. No, you have to go either starboard or, I mean, the other way around it. So sometimes you have to choose. But in general, we have to look at the world from a much more complex perspective and accept that there are things and paradoxes that just do not fit our binary organization of the world.
So the risk of emphasizing both and, I imagine, is that it can sound like it could collapse into a sort of runaway relativism, a kind of
And
mad
it's like
relativism.
you don't mean anything about anything. It's
Yeah.
just everything is the same or of equal value.
And that's why you need some kind of discrimination
Right.
and judgment,
Right.
which is not exactly either or, but that spirit of
Right.
discrimination, right?
I find that in the evolution and the path towards, I mean, the path that brought us to the complexity that we have now. There are things that have worked and shown their value. There are things that are better than others. There are things that make people happier, live longer, and more productive lives than other things. And there are things that protect people and create meaning. There are things that don't. So, I mean, there are things that are better than others.
Yes.
But there is also, I mean, we also need to be open to the fact that what I think is most important may not be what you think is most important and meaningful. And so it's not just the either or, it's also the both and.
Okay. So in that context where you're saying it's very important we grasp both that there's a plurality of views, perspectives and values, but that some things are better than others as well. And those things are both true. What is your notion of better there? How do you get to the idea of what is the value within the value judgment? What is the case? What is the rationale for something being better?
I would say higher complexity is one thing, but it's not necessarily better because it's more complex. If it, helps us prevent pain and meaninglessness.
Right.
I think, creating meaning, I think, is purpose and meaning and making sense making. So the more we have of that, the more humans can find the world meaningful and finding a purpose in life.
Right.
And the more freedom they have to do that within boundaries of societies that support those individuals, the better things are.
Okay. So your test of something being better than something else is partly its capacity to make more sense and and create more meaning.
I think so.
Right. And that will be quite culturally specific, I guess.
Yeah, and you would, if you grow up in one culture and transfer to another one, it may not make sense at all, even though it may be a much richer and more flourishing and in many respects more meaning-making culture where you have both sciences and arts and entertainment and libraries and all kinds of stuff. But if you come from a culture that don't have all these elements, it still may not make sense.
So I've heard some people describe, these are shorthand, big sweeping statements, so forgive me, but I've heard, you could think of either or as a kind of modernist mindset, relying on a certain fairly simple logical model. And you could think of both and perhaps as something resembling a postmodern mindset. Mm-hmm. And then perhaps both and with either or in it is something more like meta-modern.
Yes.
So if that's broadly right, can you talk us through why that matters, why that sort of shift should matter, and what more broadly what meta-modern might mean to you?
I'd go back one step, further and say before the either or, there was some sort of flow of non-organized values and rituals and meaning making, but there was no logical structure.
Yes.
And we really have to appreciate the Greek, and particularly Aristotle, for bringing that kind of structure and logic into our thinking.
Yes.
Because that has, I mean, we have electricity and we have all this stuff here. We wouldn't have had that without it. So, I mean, just indoor heating and plumbing, I mean, I love it. So thank you to Aristotle and the Greek. So we need the either or, absolutely. And it has created tremendous results for 4,000 years. No, that's it. 2,500 years, something like that. And then in Eastern philosophy, the both and has created a lot of meaning, but they also do not have that logical, I mean, the theoretical logic and straight philosophy, what do you call it, that we have. And so their science and society managed to create amazing results until a certain level, and then you have this renaissance in Europe where we rediscover Aristotle and combine it with the printing press and a bunch of other stuff, and then we have this cultural explosion of all kinds of things. So we have really benefited from the either or for at least the past 500 years when we rediscovered it, and now we've come to a point where it's not enough. And then we can be inspired by something from outside our cultural heritage. And yes, the both and has the danger of becoming just relativism and postmodern, wishy-washy, whatever you feel it's good. So yes, the combination of the either or and the both and the understanding of where we come from and the struggle and the pain and the suffering and all the work that went into creating what we have today. I mean, once we understand that, we also have a framework for saying that something is better than other things, and that something is really worth not just protecting and keeping, but also developing and reinterpreting into these, I mean, when we have all these new technologies.
So it's some kind of deep appreciation for the past that's inherent in the present. Before you think too much about radically dismantling it. And
like know at least what it is you're taking apart. And I mean, particularly as a woman, I know that once society dissolves, women will always be at the bottom and at the mercy of the physical strength of men. So I'm all for societal structures.
As we go forward then, and the future is being imagined and created as we speak, what do you see? What is your sense of where we're heading at the moment?
It's like society is, I mean, new technologies are challenging the political structures, the economic structures, the power structures. I mean, it's very simple. The industrialized society was based on physical goods that were produced in factories, put on trucks, and driven to stores. And then if we were to export them, there were customs barriers and negotiations about the customs and things like that. And then you had this physical or geographical gravity for physical goods. With digital goods, if they're in English, they're global from the onset when they're introduced into the market. And if you have physical goods, I mean, take a chair like this. If you want to produce more chairs, you need more resources, and you need a bigger factory, and you need transportation. If you create one copy of a computer game, you can create 1 million copies at basically the same cost. So the structure in this economy is very different. And we do not have the models for it. We don't have the economic models for it.
Political models either.
Right, political models, and we change the power structure. Because, I mean, if you own, say, I mean, if you own one of those cryptocurrencies, we used to have currencies that were guaranteed by nation states and central banks, and you could devaluate the currencies, and you could control your market and your taxes and your interest rates and all kinds of things politically by manipulating your currency. But if you have a cryptocurrency, there's nothing behind it. And this is challenging our macroeconomic models. So, I mean, and that's just one challenge. Then you have all our macroeconomic models that are built on a shortage of supply, so or shortages of everything. And now we may end up in a situation with, I mean, if we go digital and if we create a circular economy based on renewable energy, and we, if we solve our problems, we may actually face a world of plenty. And so the economic models telling us that we're in short supply do not work in a world of a surplus of goods and services and resources.
Okay.
So there are some of these models that just don't work in the next economy.
Yeah.
And we have not figured out what the new models look like. We have not figured out what's the role of the nation state if the most important goods are digital and they just go across borders everywhere.
So I've heard at various angles on this. So Jamie Bartlett, who's a kind of technology theorist and writer, speaks about the end of the nation state. He says that in essence, much of the technological infrastructure of the internet is a libertarian technology. It's inherently about individual going straight to market, not mediated by any institutional forms, and that therefore a notion of like central bank being necessary for money is questioned. And with that, the sort of monopoly on the use of force that's also essential to a nation state is questioned. So we have all of these, dissolutions of existing structures. At the same time, you said that we have to protect certain structures. So what's your sense of that tension as we go forward? Because you have certain premises of liberal democracy, of human rights, rule of law, elections, and so forth.
Right now, they're all tied up to our industrialized societies. I mean, the right and left spectrum of politics is based on somebody owning the means of production and other people not owning them, and on everybody in the British market, whether they were billionaires or the poorest workers, were still working within the same economy. And the billionaires were spending their money in the British economy. So, somehow there would be a circulation of money in the British economy. Today, the billionaires will take out their money, put them in somewhere else where they're not being taxed, and the British workers will not necessarily see the fruit of their labor coming back into their own economy. And that's a fundamental change in structure in the economy, and so we need the nation states to work together because our democratic rights and freedoms are tied up to our economic power as producers in the economy. So, the whole model is being challenged by the technological development. And I definitely think the nation state has a huge role to play, but our politicians need to understand the changes that are brought about by the technological development.
Right, which brings us to the question of what to do, and also your 30-something self coming to awareness of I ought to think about what to do. And more recently, you've produced a book called The Nordic Secret, which, if I could summarize before you do better, as I see it, is a recognition that the Nordic countries represent models of broadly successful societies with high levels of prosperity, peace, relatively good environmental protection, quite high social solidarity, relatively low inequality. And a lot of people look to them and say, what happened? And you have a story to tell about what happened and what that might mean for today.
Yeah, when we went through industrialization in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which happened relatively late, definitely a lot later than the UK, we lifted society from the bottom. We created folk high schools. For the peasants who would usually just have 7 years of school, there was a new kind of institution for these young farm hands and farm girls when they were around 18 or 20 years old. Cost some money, but it was 5 months where they learned macroeconomics and history, Christianity. They studied the Icelandic sagas, some of them even studying Icelandic. They got a taste for culture and they became Danes. They left their farm and their parents' farm as Peter Peterson's son or Peter Peterson's daughter, went to a folk high school for 5 months and came back as Danes.
5 months?
Yeah, or 3 months, whatever they could afford. But it was like a boarding school for young adults.
Or finishing school maybe, like a kind of...
Right, but we didn't have high schools for everybody back then. You didn't either, I guess. So it's like 7 years of school and then you went out to work. And here we had a chance for the young farmers, farm hands, to go to get some extra education when they were old enough to be motivated. And they learned about their society, they learned about world history, they learned about Nordic history and Danish history, and they got a Danish identity in Denmark, a Norwegian one in Norway, and a Swedish one in Sweden.
So let's just see what exactly that is there. So that's a sort of people in power. So the elites of the time.
Yeah, and very much the pastors and teachers who saw that there is something happening. There was particularly one pastor and one teacher, and they were the ones who were sort of inventing the whole thing. Yeah. But they saw that. They also saw the revolutions in Europe, 1830. Right. I mean, so 1789, 1830, 1848. It was like, we don't want that in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Okay. We want the people are somehow going to get political power. Yeah. They need to understand what the country is. Okay. Okay. So how do we do that? How do they get to the point where they love the country, right, where they will care enough about it to make wise decisions, right, not just for their own families and themselves, yes, but for the country as a whole. Right. And you get to that by, through storytelling, narrative, culture.
Okay. So if I can abstract from that, so in concrete terms, you're saying that at a period of time when there's a transition from a sort of broadly feudal society to a broadly industrial one in Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, yeah, there was a proactive cultivation of the lowest strata of society to give them a sort of sense of culture and national identity, and some also religious understanding at the time, because that was part of the culture.
That was the moral fabric. It was Christian, so
it just was, yeah, at that time. But that was precipitated by a sense of change coming. Yes. It was anticipatory governance.
They could see what happened in France, and they could see what was happening in Germany and Belgium and all over Europe. And
but to abstract, the reason I'm trying to abstract, I'm trying to get the kernel for today. In some ways, what's going on abstractly is a kind of sense that people are being empowered, right, and yet they don't know what to do with their power, right? And that's kind of what's happening today, or
it's very much, and we're, I think that a lot of people are sensing that the world is not what it used to be like. Yeah. And you and I grew up with a story saying if you go through high school, you get a good education, then you can you can get a job, you can buy an apartment or a house, you can raise a family, then you'll have a job and you'll retire, and then you'll have your retirement, and then you'll have had a nice life. And what we're facing are a number of things. First of all, the jobs are disappearing to robots, at least the industry jobs. There will be a lot of service jobs, but in service jobs you cannot increase your productivity, so they don't figure in the macroeconomic models. Even though, we might all be like organic farmers and baristas and musicians and physical therapists and things like that. We might be very happy, might be very meaningful lives, but the macroeconomic models would show that the economy doesn't grow. Yeah, yeah. So it would look as if the economy had sort of stopped evolving. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we live longer. So, and our knowledge is dating faster. Yep. So we will, by the age, if you're done with your university studies or a trade when you're 22 or 27, you may work with that for 5 or 10 years, then you need to upgrade your knowledge. Yep. Yep. And you may even have to change career when you're 40. Mm-hmm. But then you still, you'll still have 35 years of work life in front of you, so you may have a third career. Right. And what is great about that, and that's where I see a lot of opportunity, is that if you only have one education, you know one professional perspective. But if you have 2 educations, you can change perspective. Mm-hmm. So you can actually see something that nobody else can see. Right. If you have a 3rd education, you can change perspective again. Okay. And from my own life, that is what I did with comedy writing, theology, and economy, because I have these 3 perspectives as my background. Okay. So we can create a much more meaningful and richer life if we allow ourselves to get more educations, have 2 or 3 careers, and create a new narrative around what the good life is like. Mm-hmm. Maybe you need a nice house when you're in your 40s or 30s, when your kids are small and you need space. Mm. But then when you're 50, we would expect that then you buy an even bigger house. Mm. But maybe that's when you should downsize and have like a 1-bedroom apartment and go back to school and focus on something completely different, expand your mind and your knowledge about the world, maybe go traveling. But if you did that as a 50-year-old today after having had a nice career as, a professor or nurse or school teacher or carpenter, whatever, people would think like, why are you doing that for? Well, why?
Again, because it's not socially sanctioned. It's not in the cultural atmosphere.
So we have to change the narrative about what is the good life, and we can create much richer lives that way.
Okay. So I want to come to the notion of Bildung as a sort of organizing concept for a lot of this material in a second. But first, you mentioned those three perspectives of your sort of business background, your comedy writer background, and also the theology. Yeah. So it's probably a good moment, given that you've spoken about the need for structure, in a cultural context where quite a lot of people are reporting themselves to be non-religious. Although the surveys are not very good usually, the questions of how you draw your spiritual affiliation are pretty naive. Nonetheless, there are many people who call themselves spiritual but not religious, as a way of sort of saying, holding on to aspect of that but not really committing to anything. So from your own experience, would you say that's a broadly good thing, or would you say it's somehow naive or immature?
It can be both. It depends on how much weight you put on it and how you use it and with whom you use it and the situations, because I see spirituality as something that's very intimate, and it works in groups where everybody can have eye contact. Okay. So once you have
one second, just pause on that, because it's very precise, eye contact.
Right. So, I mean, if you're in a circle where everybody can sort of see each other in the room, great, do all the meditation you want. But once you're in bigger groups and you cannot have eye contact anymore, either you have to create organized religion and get some explicit rules and create some poetry and some rituals and things where you know what you're supposed to do even when you do not have eye contact, or you end up, that's my perspective, you end up in some sort of touchy-feely, I mean, you risk making a mess and you risk becoming a sort of creating a sort of totalitarian system where you want to own people's feelings. Right. You want to dictate what people are supposed to feel during this meditation, rather than being able to look them in the eyes and feel if they feel the right thing during the meditation. Yes. So I think that religion as organized spirituality, particularly when we look at our heritage and all the richness that we have in our hymns and in the storytelling and the big dramas and the big existential questions that have haunted us as long as we've been human beings and that are expressed. I mean, the more we know about them, the more we can draw on them. And I mean, also Shakespeare and all these other big dramas, Greek mythology, Nordic mythology. I mean, all these stories where we face pain and big challenges and dilemmas and life is a challenge. I mean, if you cannot have eye contact with everybody, you need that kind of story. If you can have eye contact with people, you can go into a meditation or a conversation and relate to personal issues. But once you lose the eye contact, you need to accept religion.
Okay, interesting. And would you say you have accepted religion in that sense?
Yeah.
Right. Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I converted to Judaism when I was in my 30s. Because I studied theology, I meant to become a pastor in the Danish church, which is a Lutheran Protestant. And the reason why I wanted to become a pastor was because whenever I did go to church, which was very rare, it was so incredibly boring, I figured somebody has to do something about this. And eventually it was like, nobody else seems to be doing it, it might have to be me. Okay. So I studied theology from 1993 to 1999 or something. I completed almost 2 semesters of the curriculum, but it took me 4 or 5 years to do it. So, and what really spoke to me in the Christian texts was the Jewish part, the Old Testament. Okay. And I had this. I mean, there's something about that Bronze Age, Iron Age text that has this sort of earthy, human, original substance to it that I did not find in the New Testament, and I was deeply fascinated by all these little historical details and practical details and how people struggle, and one thing that I like about it's interesting when you read the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran. As texts, they're incredibly different. The Old Testament is very different texts, and you have, 2,000 years of mythology with people that are almost like cartoon-like, and then they become more and more psychologically advanced and real people. And God goes through the same journey as well. I mean, he starts out as this cartoonish figure that says, Adam, where are you? Right. And then he struggles with Abraham, and then he becomes more and more sophisticated as well. And you have poetry, you have narrative, you have weird historical facts, and you have old Mesopotamian mythology, tons of stuff. And you get to the New Testament, and it's a story that covers, I don't know, 30 years or so, 40 years, but it's written over 130 years. And the texts are, in some respect, I mean, there are the 4 Gospels, and then you have some letters, and then you have the Revelation at the end. But other than that, I mean, the texts are very much alike, and they're kind of sober, except I guess it's the Revelation of John, which was also like, my first reading, I was like, what did he smoke? I mean, but then you get to the Quran, and there is no storyline. There are all these messages, and it's written over a very short period of time compared to the other 2 texts. I mean, there are some uncertainties about when and who wrote what, but you have all this stuff that has been picked up in the Jewish and Christian tradition that is brought into another culture, and we still struggle with the biblical stories. I mean, there's so much power in those stories that we can't stop looking at them.
And why should we, right? I guess is the
right.
question.
I mean, so there is this sort of human essence in there.
Yeah, but here's the challenge, I suppose, that you said yourself that in this phase of history, when much is being deconstructed, either culturally and intellectually, or by technology and politically, we have to be careful we don't completely dissolve all our structures and lead to chaos. Some sort of ordering principles need to remain. Now, religion was one of those ordering principles, and we've obviously moved along many generations of critiquing religion and secularizing in some sort of sense, at least in European countries. And yet, you're saying we need some sort of higher order vantage point whereby we go back to religion, but somehow don't dissolve and collapse into it again. Right. What does that look and feel like? More individually and collectively.
I prefer not to talk about God, because I doubt that there is one. I'm a practicing doubting.
But the doubt is real, right?
Right, and I mean the heritage is real, the stories are meaningful, and the way that they understand us as human beings are amazing. Yes. And the conflicts that are being played out are still relevant. And the moral dilemmas are still relevant. And to have texts that are 3,000 years old that are still meaningful across all these changes tells us something central about what it means to be human. Right. And so there, I mean, if once we have artificial intelligence that starts worshiping Yahweh, then we may have some robots that we should not fear. But until they are just as irrational as we are and have that dimension in their software, they're not going to understand us, and we're not going to understand them. Okay. So I mean, we're, as a species, we have to come to terms with who we are and what we are, and to deal with that as a species, and decide, and that's I call it global existentialism, who do we want to be? Do we still want to be human? Do we still want to struggle with all the moral issues, or are we, and with our shortcomings, and with the pain, and with all the unpleasant things that an adult life contains if you dare live a real life? Yes. Or do we just want to smooth out everything and play computer games all day and have robots do all our work for us, and then, I don't know, live for 120 years on some kind of life support?
So the obvious question there is that either or a both and. I mean, you seem to be setting it up for a both and.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many opportunities in the technologies that we are developing. There are also so many challenges, and we need wiser decisions around what we develop and what we're willing to pay for as consumers. And that is a moral choice that we have to make as individuals and as families, as local communities, as workplaces, and as nation states, and that's where you get the nation state again. I mean, we need to be smarter as societies if we want to keep our freedoms and democracy.
Yes.
And one of the things that you talked about, the new technologies being libertarian, libertarianism ends up in monopolies. It cannot sustain itself as a free market.
Yes.
So we need to design the right market.
Yes.
And that market somehow has to be a global market now that we have global technologies.
Okay.
So we need a global perspective, and in Europe, a European perspective, a Western perspective, a democratic perspective, and a national perspective.
Okay.
And they need to function on all these, I mean, we need to function, these systems need to function on their different levels.
Right. Okay.
And that makes it very complex,
Very
because
complex.
usually we just look at one level and say, ooh, this is Britain, this is Denmark, this is Sweden, and we want it to work as that entity.
And within that entity, there's the economy, then there's society,
Right,
then
exactly.
there's the person, right? You're saying we need a level of complexity that brings all of these things together somehow, and yet still has a level of discrimination and differentiation and integration within it. So that's key to, I believe, your new book, The Nordic Secret. The notion of Bildung, which I believe is originally Germanic. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about why that concept is so important and what it means to you and why others might care about it at this time.
Yeah, it's funny with English, because we cannot translate Bildung.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a German word. It's like Schadenfreude. I mean, the Germans came up with it, and we have to use the word. So, Bildung is about taking personal responsibility. And I mean, Schiller and the Swiss pedagogue Pestalozzi writes 3 phases of the adult life. There's the first phase when you're controlled by your emotions, and thus you're not free. You're controlled by your emotions, you cannot make choices, they choose for you. The second phase is when you have internalized the norms of society. They use a different language, but that's what they're saying. So you're a loyal citizen, or subject to your king, but you do what people expect you to do. You can be trusted within the rules of society, which is important if you want a mate. If you want somebody's parents to allow you to marry their daughter or son, you better play by the rules. So that's the second phase. And we all go through that, I mean, hopefully in puberty, where we internalize the norms of society. But it also makes you conform to just do what everybody expects. Yeah. So you have to be able to transcend that or transgress that and develop your own moral compass, where you can take personal responsibility, where you are in touch with your emotions, and are still a team player and loyal to your society.
So transcending and including somehow.
Right. Yeah. So you integrate these 2 things in your moral being and your adult life. Yeah. And that is when you can be trusted and active as a citizen. And actually Friedrich Schiller says that these are the only ones who can handle political power. Okay. He writes a lot based on the French Revolution and the bloodbath, and he was like, how could they? They finally got rid of the king, the tyrant, and then they could not handle the political freedom. Right. Why was that? Okay. And his answer is, well, there were all these people who were in the throes of their passions, they could not handle it. Right. Then there were all the people who did what everybody else did, they could not handle it. Right. And then there were the people who had moral courage, and there unfortunately weren't enough of them. Okay. So, I mean, if we're going to handle the technological challenges that we have and the future, we need more people who are loyal to society, who are in touch with their emotions, and who have their own inner moral compass. Okay,
so I hear that, and it's very persuasive, but I am also hearing the inner voice of the social critic who's saying, that's so elitist, you know.
Yeah.
Will of the people. Surely you're just saying that those people are not up to it. Of course we know what we're doing. How dare you tell us what to do?
That's why it's so amazing that 150 years ago, the Danish and Swedish and Norwegian peasants went through much of this process. And what we can see is it was still a very Christian society, and I think they really wanted the peasants and the workers to just internalize the norms of society. But they also,
But by doing that, they seed something else.
Right. Yeah. Once we get into the 20th century, definitely there's a movement towards everybody being moral individuals.
But the asymmetry I see is that back then, elite members of society are telling poorer members of society who don't really have any choice, to do something good for themselves and help conform and help build a nation.
And it's
Pre-democracy.
right.
Right. Now,
No, it's parallel to the development
Parallel,
of
okay.
democracy. But what's interesting is that the German idealists, they were just talking about this model for the bourgeoisie.
Right.
They were not thinking of the peasants as potential political agents.
Okay.
And that is the Nordic secret.
Okay.
Because there was an understanding that this has to be for everybody. Because if it's not for everybody, I mean, what was it, like 80% of the population were farmers, farmhands, sharecroppers, whatever.
Yeah.
So there was an understanding that we need to lift the entire society.
Yes.
It may not be everybody who can go to one of those schools.
Okay.
It may not be everybody who will be active in the cooperatives, but we need to create places for education where everybody has the chance.
Yes.
And it was, I mean, across society that there was, I mean, there were people who were against it, of course, but there were also people in all parts of society who saw that, yes, we need to do something because we do not want revolutions.
Okay, so back then it makes sense, and with hindsight it's beautifully clear. Where we are now, there's some similar injunction to complexify the consciousness of the population, but the political structures are different, the cultural context is different. So are you saying it has to be done but we don't know how to do it? Or is it possible it just can't be done?
No, I mean, I think it can be done, but we also have to realize that, I mean, it's not enough that you complete your education when you're 22 or 29. Right. Go out, get some children, start a family, work, do something, and then when you're 40, go back and study history and literature and the arts, because now it actually makes sense. I mean, we studied Medea in high school. And it made no sense that she chopped up her two sons, but if you've gone through a divorce, you know exactly how she feels.
Right.
So, I mean, there are things that you understand when you're 40 that you will never understand when you're 22.
And just say we're not endorsing that, we're just mentioning that it was an, you know.
Yes, we don't want anybody to chop up their children, but you understand the feeling. So, so we need to understand that, I mean, maybe we should, I mean, go back to the arts and sciences and just expand our minds when we're...
What's interesting from what I think I hear you saying is that it's not as though the kind of education you need to cultivate the population is of a particular like 10-week course or something. It's more that there's something about taking responsibility for broadening perspective that by its nature over the life cycle will multiply upon itself, complexifying as perspective builds on perspective, and that inherently leads to the kind of complexification of society that you need to solve
and the
complex
understanding of the
problems.
complexity of society, and a different kind of conversation. I mean, imagine if we had engineers who also knew psychology, and pastors who knew pedagogy, and journalists who knew the arts. I mean, you could have entirely different conversations if our politicians were not only, what are they, legal scholars and
also economists,
usually
lawyers,
economists, lawyers, blah, blah, blah. I mean, if they were also poets, that is, I mean, Goethe, he studied law, we know him as the poet, but he was actually a Geheimerat when he was 26 in Weimar, and was part of the Duke's inner circle of 3 members of his government. So, I mean, we know his poetry, but very few of us know that he was actually a politician. And imagine if our politicians were writing poetry and books that were being studied 200 years out in the future while they were running our countries, what kind of countries we would have.
Yes. Okay, I understand. So it's the kind of perspective taking you're calling for is, you know, in practical terms, it's a sort of implicit injunction to see that adult education is not merely a benefit for the individual, but a necessary value to society.
It's not professional training either.
Yes.
It's broadening your perspective,
yeah.
and opening the scopes.
And that's not a nice to have, right? The point is,
it's a necessity because our democracy is relying upon it.
Right. So it's almost like as the old structures are dissolving, those are the new structures that have to arrive to keep things intact.
Right. And we have, I mean, we talked about spirituality and religion. I mean, we have so much heritage that we're not aware of. A very poignant piece of poetry that describes our spiritual development and the importance of intimate relationships And our connection, intimate emotional connection to nature is Ode an die Freude, our European hymn. Right. So, I mean, here we have a European Union that promotes itself by a spiritual song. I don't know how many people are aware of that, but it's about personal development and intimacy and how to create relationships to other people.
Thank you very much, Lene. It's been a great pleasure, and I wish everyone to read the book The Nordic Secret.
So do I.
And to get to know Lene Andersen better. Thank you very much.